everyone. It's so great to be with you. My name is Michaela Kolofsky. This is our final Readers, Books and Conversation event for 2023. And we are absolutely thrilled to be joined by our guest of honour, Robyn Davidson.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Welcome.
We meet together tonight on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land. And I pay my deep respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us tonight. Tonight I'm going to speak with Robyn for about 45 minutes, and we will leave time for your questions. We'll have a roving mic that will come around at the end so you can stay exactly where you are. And if you try and keep your questions question-like, we can get through as many of them as we can. You also may have noticed a very handsome, very attractive table at the back of the room. Our wonderful colleagues at Berklow Booksellers are selling books, and you can have a book signed. You can buy Robyn's memoir or tracts at the back of the room and have a chat with her then as well, so there'll be more time for you. I want to tell you a little bit about Robyn before we get going, and then we'll dive in. Robyn Davidson was born on a cattle property in Queensland. She went to Sydney in the late 1960s to study and then returned to study in Brisbane before going to Alice Springs to prepare for her journey across Australia with camels and one dog, which she wrote about in her best-selling, never-out-of-print book, Tracks. Since then, she's travelled extensively and lived in London, New York and India. In the early 1990s, she migrated with and wrote about nomads in northwest India. Now she's back in Australia, based in regional Victoria, and she's the author of Tracks, as we mentioned, Desert Places, Travelling Light, No Fixed Address, Nomads and the Fate of the Planet, the Picador Book of Journeys, and her new book is the memoir, Unfinished Woman. On every page of this memoir, Robyn reflects on the way we use imagination to make our memories. This is a powerful and poignant book about inheritances, about family and about freedom, what it means to Robyn, both socially, politically, geographically and mentally, and why she kept trying to write about her mother over so many years and couldn't. Tonight I'm going to ask her about walking across the Australian deserts, about years in India, about what home means, and about the truths and falsehoods that we carry with us in every memory of ours. This is a book that almost defies categorisation, but at its core, it's about how Robyn experiences being alive, the metaphysical, the existential, the philosophical. And she can put that down on the page. She's that kind of writer. It's a book that presses itself into your heart and your mind. Please join me again in making Robyn Davidson very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Michaela. Thank you, everyone.
Robyn, I think the best way to begin is to ask if you would read the prelude to the book to give people a taste of how you write and what it's like.
Sure. Where are we? Okay. I think I've got enough light. Can everyone hear okay? Yeah, good. Okay. When I was 11 years old, my mother gave me a pair of gold sandals. These were for best and not at all suitable for school. In all my life so far, I had worn socks and sensible lace-ups to school. Other children were allowed to run round barefoot. There was cow shit between their toes and their feet splayed out like thick T-bone steaks. But they were common and the Davidsons were not. What could it have been about that morning in particular that gave me the courage to end my mother's dominion over me? To dress not only in the gold sandals, but in a gathered green poplin skirt with rope petticoat, rather than the pleated tartan that was customary. Children mocking at first breaths, perhaps, or a boy sending love notes across the classroom. Loyalty to a future self conflicted with loyalty to my mother's realm. The old bindings had to be cut. I came down the wrought iron staircase inside our house. My mother stood below me, more a force than a person. She held my blue plastic lunchbox. I clutched my school port. We argued, and it seemed that this had never happened before. I knew that I would wear these clothes, these sandals. I had already won the battle inside my own will. "Aren't you even going to kiss me goodbye?" she said. Not guilt, nor love, nor fear must be allowed to weaken the momentum of victory. Without turning around, I flounced through the kitchen and out the front door. No, I won't. When I came home that afternoon, my mother was dead. This could be the beginning of a memoir, a curtain drawn aside to reveal the theatre of life as it exists inside my mind and no one else's. But although I know the gold sandals were real, that I wore them on a particular day and this led to an altercation with my mother on the stairs, these facts exist as no more than an instant of sense perception filed in memory and encased as a kind of seed. The other details in the picture, the skirt, port, lunchbox, the duration in which the scene unfurls, the walk through the kitchen, the inference that I understood at the time the import of my actions, these have been furnished by imagination. If I continued with the story, it would unfurl out of that seed, that moment, and its relationship to what really happened would become increasingly obscure. You want me to go on?
Yeah.
Is that enough? Thanks.
That's how the book begins.
Thank you.
In this prelude, Robyn, you also write, I've been trying to write about my mother for years, and I wanted to ask, to begin with, what kinds of attempts you made, and were they very different in style and tone, and what would stop you from continuing?
Look, it was sort of hell right from the beginning, this book. Well, first of all, I didn't want to write about myself particularly. I don't like writing in the first-person pronoun. I think memoir is a very dodgy form, very slippery, morally dodgy. And also I had no interest in my own past whatsoever. But then what happened, I was living in London and approaching the age at which my mother had died, which was late 40s. And these memories started coming back rather unbidden. Often keyed through music. I'd hear a sort of phrase of music from the 50s and sort of hear it in my mind, and these memories would rise. And I was very curious about that process and why it was happening, quite disconcerting. So, of course, being a writer, I started taking notes and sort of thinking about it, and lots of notes. But as soon as I sort of proceeded or got beyond, say, 10 pages, I just knew that I hadn't got the tone. And so eventually I wrote an essay about memoir form and why I disliked it as a form and why it was dodgy. And why this particular memoir would never be written and couldn't be written, and sent it off to my agent, and he said, "You're mad, this is the beginning of the book." So I was sort of trapped.
Yeah. It's a very powerful beginning. And I did want to ask you two things. How young were you? You were a young child when she died.
I was 11.
And I wanted to ask you what some of your strongest memories are of her, but also how her death has shaped your life.
Big question. Well, of course, I can't know. It's not a question I can answer, really.
Yes.
I thought I had almost no memories of her. A few milky photographs, and that was about it. And also, I wasn't interested in her. Honestly, from the day she died until this part of my life, I never gave her a second thought. It was like she'd just been expunged. So the memories started to come back, but the truth is, of course, you never can reconstruct a person. She's gone forever. But in bringing back those memories, of doing the work of memory, and of giving her some sort of voice, what I've realised is that we liked each other. So, and really that is enough for me. I don't have to have her back. I don't have to reconstruct her. I just need to know that we liked each other, and she was a good enough mother to get me through.
You write at one point early in the book that you felt like you had a duty to write about her. Can you talk about that impulse?
Well, it did feel like that. I mean, if I'd lived in another century, I would have thought I was haunted by her. It really was a feeling of her presence, of the fact that she had been silenced completely, made invisible, totally. I mean, just disappeared. So obviously she was very strongly in my unconscious, my subconscious. I don't know quite. Where were we going with that?
Well, you wrote about feeling a duty to write about her.
Yes, that's right.
And then it was also that there was no one left to ask about her.
It was there was no one else who could or would write about her, who would give her that voice. And even from the beginning, it felt also like a fairy tale task. You know, those impossible tasks like Cinderella had. That's what it was like right from the beginning. Yeah. So I couldn't write the book, but I had to write the book. I didn't want to write the book. She wanted me to write the book. Yeah. So it was this pull all the way through, really.
You said just a moment ago that, you know, how do you write a memoir when you don't like writing about the past, which I think is wonderful. And there's a line you repeat all the way through the book. The book's also very funny. I mean, it starts with this very searingly serious, hit you in the face kind of moment of death. But the book is hilarious as well. But you describe what you call a scorched earth policy toward the past. Can you unpack that for us?
Well, I think it was a survival mechanism, and a pretty good one, really. You know, I'm not sure that we need to scrabble around in the past as much as we think we do. And it got me through a lot of years, a lot of decades, because it was, you know, by any standards, it was a pretty traumatic childhood. So...
You talk about throwing bombs behind you.
Well, I think it was literally... I was very aware that I had to construct myself out of almost nothing. And so that drive to go into the future and not look back, and the image I used in the book was throwing bombs over my shoulder and seeds into the future on the principle that there'd be something growing when I got there. So going back over the past was quite uncharacteristic.
You write very beautifully and lovingly about both your parents. You know, you had a chance to get to know your father in your 20s and this kind of this sort of second relationship with him. But tell us a bit about who your mother was and how she ended up living in often very remote, very bushy places, swinging kerosene lamps at brown snakes.
Well, she was a city girl, a very city girl, talented, nervy, neurotic, adorable, funny, tiny little thing. And it was a wartime marriage, and my father was 17 years older than she was. And of course the war stirred things around. People met who might not otherwise have met. And he was of the old sort of Queensland bush aristocracy, landed, but poor. They were always scrabbling over money. But he took her to live out on this property where I was born. There was no electricity. It was really rough, and snakes came into the house, poisonous snakes. And she had 2 children there, and I think worked incredibly hard. They did work incredibly hard, both of them. And I guess she was just profoundly lonely. She wouldn't have fitted into that society very well. And we didn't have a car. Very remote, very lonely, very harsh. And also his family didn't approve of her, so she didn't even have that kind of sense of belonging.
Tell us about your father before I ask you to read a wonderful vignette about your family as well. Tell us about him. Can you also give us all of his names? He had many names, and they are very impressive.
Ansell, Guildford, Montgomery, Lindsay, Nugent, Davidson. And the fact there's this funny story that he told, that when his family sent him letters during the war, his fellow soldiers called him Antbed, Guildhall, Montgumboil. They made all these jokes about it.
Tell me about him.
Well, he was a man of his time. the sweetest person. Everyone liked him and loved him. He had a sweet temperament. He was shy. He was immensely capable. Terrific in the bush, knew everything about the bush, but I think was happiest on his own in the bush. Hopeless father and husband, but sweet-natured. And the problem was that his ideology, which was essentially social Darwinism, so that, however regrettable it might be that blacks had to die out because of this superior race, that's nature for you.
Wow. And
similarly, women, of course. So that aspect of the marriage also, I think, was quite difficult for my mother. Although I'm sure she colluded in that idea, as women did. I mean, the 50s, I think, were very, very particularly difficult for women, in Australia anyway. That post-war, getting back into the family, buttoning down.
You describe that they used to sort of flick each other with tea towels in the kitchen and weep with laughter. There's a lot of joy. There was a lot of joy between them.
There was a lot of joy and a lot of humour. They were both quite funny, quite amusing, humorous. And yes, they played together. They obviously adored each other. But I think she was under the thumb, as a friend said of her. She was under his thumb. But these things are always complex. Relationships are complex, and they carry the ideology of the time, very much so.
Can you read the beautiful section on page 16? Sure. That starts, "Let's pause here." It's a wonderful description of Robyn's family that I'd love everyone to hear. Should be a tag 16. In there.
Yeah, there we are. Look, I might just put my glasses on. I can't quite see very well. That's better.
So from "Let's pause here" to "Just unusual enough."
Right. Let's pause here to describe the Davidsons as they must have appeared then. Mark. 6'1", cheek skin smooth and smelling of Old Spice shaving cream. Springing curly auburn hair cut short back and sides, aristocratic nose, thin lips, bright blue eyes, Errol Flynn moustache. He is in his mid-50s, though appears younger. Dressed in khakis, elegantly faded and pressed, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a plaited kangaroo skin belt sitting comfortably under the stomach. A gloriously handsome man whose beauty is marred by a small balding spot at the crown of his head where the hair is as fine as a baby's. The thumb of his left hand is missing and one toe. He is very slightly deaf because he was with the 2nd Anti-Tank during the war and the blast of artillery damaged the nerves in his ears. Gwen, 4'11", thin as a harebell, with shoulders like a perched bird. She has hazel eyes and light brown hair, cut and permed in the fashion of the day, a la the House of Windsor. Very little makeup, a stylish cotton frock that she has made herself, but you would never guess. Sandals, bare brown legs, unshaved because shaving is vulgar. Half moon showing on neat nails, dabs of eau de cologne behind ears and in the crooks of elbows. In spite of the long journey, she might have just stepped out of the pages of a pattern book. She is pretty, but not only that, she is noticeable. How to put it, she has flair. There are 2 dimples in her face and her teeth are ever so slightly bucked. The dimples are like inverted commas, calling attention to her vivacity and charm. It is a spirited face, made for and by laughter. She laughs in the same way that she sings, to give people pleasure, and therefore to be loved. She is 17 years younger than her husband. Children. Margaret, the eldest, has masses of auburn ringlets tied up in bows, a burnishing of russet lights through thick brown gloss, fabulous Davidson hair. She is chubby and watchful. Youngest. Plump and bonny, with a cliché of blonde curls and baby blue eyes. Both are beautifully dressed and wear black patent leather court shoes with ankle socks. It is obvious that a lot of work goes into this family, into its presentation and confidence. The 50s could have produced nothing more representative of its best. It is an unusual family, but not too unusual, just unusual enough.
Thank you. Thanks, Robyn. Like a lot of people, I read tracts many years ago, and as someone who didn't grow up in the bush or on the land, I kind of marvelled at the time at how you could have gone out into that desert, into those places on your own, and not only survived but flourished. And this book sheds a lot of light on that, about how you felt when you were in the bush. You talked before about your father was maybe at his best when he was on his own and in nature. Can you talk to us about when you first realised that was also where you felt kind of in your element?
Yes, it's odd. Well, I was very lucky to have the father I had in the sense he didn't teach me anything consciously. Because I was a girl, obviously he wouldn't teach me anything.
Obviously.
Obviously. But, of course, you absorb from your parents, and I absorbed the way he was relaxed in the bush. And the biggest treat was walking with him in the paddocks and talking about nature and how things worked and science. So I think I already had in my DNA, so to speak, a kind of comfortableness in being in nature, and that wonderful country childhood as well. So lucky. But going to the desert, well, I sort of knew I had to be in a desert. That was the instigation of the whole project, really. Camels were a secondary thing. Well, I only got camels because they were free, and I only had $6 when I got to Alice Springs, so I couldn't buy a car. But as soon as I got to that red country, it just felt like I'd come home in that landscape. It was... Australian deserts are just so exquisite and complex and interesting and varied.
You have a beautiful way of considering, you write very powerfully about how you feel about being in nature, but you then sort of imagine how nature feels about us. Can you share that with people? I thought that was really fascinating.
Well, I don't think nature gives it. I don't think nature is aware of us. Do you know what I mean? It's like the universe doesn't care about us. It doesn't give a damn. We're just part of its process. And it's a blind process, I think. In fact, when after my mother had died, I had a sort of, what would you call it, a kind of insight, I guess, that was hugely powerful in my life ever after, when I truly understood that there was no God, there was no nothing, there was nothing except this sort of storm of energies which we didn't understand and would never understand. And I was only about 12, so it was too much of an insight for a child that young, and there was no one to explain it to me or talk about it. And I think, people assume it was my mother's death that propelled me to do certain things, but I think it was more that insight and wanting to make a life that was something substantial you could throw against that wall of meaninglessness. Something like that.
I want to come back to the desert in a moment, but it's an interesting question to ask you off the back of your saying the universe doesn't care about us in any way, shape or form. But when you left Brisbane, you came to Sydney at around the age of 19. And over those years in your early 20s, you met people who were part of what we'd call the counterculture movement. They were protesting against the Vietnam War. They were choosing not to get married or have children. They were creating communities based on communal values, not individual ones. What was it like being in those communities at that time, and what did you feel was possible with those kind of ideas as a fuel?
Oh, fabulous, fabulous. It was a fabulous time to be young. I mean, of course it was dangerous, but, you can die eating peanuts, And it just allowed for, everyone was attempting new things, breaking boundaries, demanding to be free, and it was all in reaction to the 50s, to the sort of repression of the 50s. So there was tremendous experimentation, but also we sort of looked after each other. So there were these big shared houses and huge age range. I was usually the youngest, so I was like the mascot. but we kind of looked after each other and cared about each other. But, you know, it was risky. There was drugs, there was craziness.
I know it's hard for any of us. We're only ever kind of in our own generation at any given moment, and our perception is going to be changed by where we stand,
where you are in relation to it. Yes.
Where we are in relation to it.
Yes.
But I wondered if you had any thoughts on how change is possible when we look at the time you just described and the time now where the communal is less of a value and the value is more kind of the deification of individuals, the kind of the idea that my needs and my wellness and my happiness,
my body is my temple.
My being is the most important thing. You know, how hard is it to make change when we've lost some sense of the communal? And that's my own value judgment.
Well, it was complex because it was communal, but it was also, the individual was also important. So there was a bit of a tension there, actually. But it was also hugely political, and we gave each other a really solid political education. We kind of knew how those big systems worked. But, you know, the forces of history... I think what happened as the individual became the consumer, and this new ideology of consumerism sort of swallowed up the 60s, made it null and void, took the sting out of it, and turned it into product. And now when people think of the 60s, they think of the swinging 60s and the sort of the, you know, Mary Quant and so on. But really the guts of it was politics. Interesting.
It is interesting. I want to come into the desert. You spoke about it a moment ago of feeling a sense of being in the right place, a sense of belonging in the desert. And the memoir is something where you've had a chance to look back on that time. Do you have any clearer sense of what led you to want to go and do what you did in the desert, to walk that far?
I knew that I had to do something big and difficult in order for me to pull myself together, to integrate, I suppose. I saw myself as very incompetent, very unformed, sort of all over the place. So that was the personal reason. And then it was the early 70s, and as I said, the 60s had sort of changed, and there was a sense of, not disappointment, perhaps disillusionment in the air. You know, the world actually wasn't going to change much. So people were a little bit at odds with, you know, what they would do, what was happening. So yes, for me it was needing to be alone, needing to pull myself into a person, to make a person, and to do something big enough and challenging enough for that to happen. And as I said before, and also I had no intention of writing about it. I didn't think anyone else would be remotely interested.
Was it hard for you when that journey became so well known?
Very hard.
Did it feel like it was less yours? Less, that it belonged to you less somehow?
Indeed. It was, indeed, that's exactly right. It sort of became everyone's, which is lovely, terrific. But of course, it turned into something completely different than what I had envisioned or expected. And there was a photographer involved who took these exquisite photos. But I looked at these photos and I realised even then that those photos were robbing me of being the subject of my own story. They really made me an object. Now I look at them and it's fine. I just see beautiful photographs. But it's as if there's two categories of memory in the head about that trip. One are my own personal ones that I keep very kind of to myself, and the others are the sort of public ones and the photos and all of that. Tracks.
There was a film made about it, not that long ago.
No.
But I know that you write about it in this book. You mentioned it before, that Hollywood had been knocking on your door for many years. Can you just give us one example of some of the insane ideas they had for how to turn your book into a Hollywood film?
Oh, they were hilarious. I have received scripts like you wouldn't believe. Right from the beginning, the film industry was interested, and it went through various options. One of whom was actually Sidney Pollack, and he took me to lunch in London. And the first thing he said was, "Honey, you're not going to like what I'm going to do to your book." I just loved him for that. It was so right.
Unsurprisingly, that film was never made. Yeah.
Well, I was an idiot. He offered me a lot of money. But I thought that it shouldn't go to Hollywood, and that if it was to be made, for the main reason that I wanted to keep some control of how Aboriginal people were portrayed, and I felt that it was such a quintessentially Australian story, it should somehow be made here. So, yeah. But there was one script I got that got very close to being made, actually, and Julia Roberts was going to be me. And
naturally.
And there's a scene where Robyn has to find her way across the desert, because she's lost, of course. And some nice Aboriginal people teach her the dreaming. In fact, the snake dreaming. And there's a scene where the men are, inducting her into this deep and meaningful thing, and they're carrying her naked around a fire.
Sure.
I'd have had to have left Australia.
Thank goodness for your good taste. None of us want to see that. I don't want to see that. No. I do want to ask you quickly, though, because you write beautifully in tracks, and you refer to him a little bit as well, that part of, as you said, that part of your journey you met up with Rick Smolan, who took those incredible photos and now iconic photos.
Yeah.
But you were also joined on some of your walk by Mr. Eddie, who's a very powerful character and was a very important person.
Very important.
What are some of the things he shared with you, and what were some of the lands he walked you through?
He took me from his little outstation or settlement, Pippaladjara, which is just inside the South Australian border near where the boundaries meet, through a section of his dreaming to Warburton. And we were all together, I guess, about a month. I sort of don't remember now, but it's roughly that. And it was such a stroke of good fortune, really. I mean, it made that trip, it gave it back its meaning, I suppose. And again, it's hard to say directly what I got from him, but just watching the way that old man was utterly, existentially at home in his country, and that feeling of it's I don't know how to describe it, but you just understand that he is utterly at one with where he is. So he and it are the same thing. Yeah.
It's a beautiful way to describe it. When you write about that journey you took through the Australian deserts, and you said this in tracks, and you also say it in the prelude to this book, you write, the fictional me seems to have a greater authenticity than the flux of contradictions, mental disappearances, memories and self-talk that must have constituted my inner life at the time. The fictionalising of myself was instinctive, guileless and completely candid. And I wondered if you could reflect, because you've now written memoir, on what it's been like to live alongside that fictional you for all these years. For
all these years, truly. It's the strangest thing. Because you create it. It's not dishonest, it's as truthful as you can be, or I was as truthful as I could be, and that constant process of trying to knock the ego aside and get to something deeper. But it is a very strange dislocation of the self, I guess, because you're constructing a life, and you're constructing a Robyn Davidson, who's me but not me. Yeah, it's a bit weird.
You write beautifully about isolation, about not just the importance of loneliness, it's not a TED talk, but about what isolation, no, it comes to that, like, let's all be alone together. But you write about isolation in a way that I hadn't come across anyone talking about it in that way. And you explain the way in which, for you, loneliness is a fertile thing. Could you talk a little bit about that idea?
Yes. Well, I think it's the deepest part of us, and it's the scariest part of us, of course. But if you can tolerate it, and it can be very painful, we all know that, but if you can just sort of be with it, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes you can sort of move into a different kind of consciousness, I think. And certainly on the trip, there were certain key moments for me when I too felt that I had merged with my landscape, that I became part of the net, and that I couldn't do anything I couldn't touch anything without affecting the whole of the net. So yes, it's, consciousness is such a strange phenomenon. No one knows what it is. And it's malleable, and, we limit ourselves tremendously out of fear, I think.
It's funny that you mentioned fear as well, because I wondered about that when I read Tracks, and then when I read other things you've experienced. There's a wonderful scene where Robyn's talking about camping in India and waking up to leopards that are out on the tent, And yet you say that fear was kind of around you, but it didn't lead you.
It never has, and I don't mean that I'm not fearful. I think I'm governed by fear in many ways. I'm very fearful. That's my temperament. But the curiosity is much, much more powerful than the fear. I think that's what I'd say. And the need to understand it, or understand things, understand myself, understand the world. And fear is an automatic part of that, I think.
You mentioned in the beginning of this conversation about memory, about how we store memory and how we recall memory, and how hard that is to do if you don't necessarily want to investigate the past, but that we can dwell too long there, but we sometimes also need to look backward. Yes. But I wondered if I could ask you a kind of a memoir-y question on that front, which is, if memory is always coloured by what we know happened or what we know might have happened, then as you say, memory is always kind of shot through with falsehood. It's always something we're kind of making up as we go. I think I remembered it this way. And I wondered, when I was reading your book, I thought, well, if memory is shot through with falsehood, then the self I've constructed, or the self you've constructed, is unreliable. And we build our whole lives on these unreliable people and go, well, that's what happened, and that's who I am, and this is why.
Unreliable stories.
Unreliable stories, it was unreliable, narrator. We're fascinated by them. Have you made peace with that idea? Where do you sit with that idea, having then written this wonderful memoir?
I'm okay about. I think writing the memoir has made me understand what memory is and isn't. So it's been quite useful in that way. But, we're lumped with it. That's what we are. That's the animal we are. But I'm very aware that, I might remember a really key thing that's, it's absolutely there. I absolutely remember it, and it's clear. And then maybe 6 months later, I look back at the same scene, and I notice that it's slightly altered, or it's a bit more dramatic, or something else is happening around it. So really the whole process is just infused with imagination. Yeah.
How important for you are possessions in calling back memories?
They were very important. Because I've been so nomadic, my possessions have been scattered all over the world. And unfortunately, I do like pretty things. It's bad for a nomad to like pretty things.
She contains multitudes.
Yes, that's right. But when I started with the book, I'd bought a flat in London with some friends, and It was very important that I collect those things. They were like mnemonics. They sort of contained memories and stories. And I was the only person who knew what they were there for. I mean, some of them very beautiful, but that wasn't the point. It was that they sort of indicated that I had a coherent past, I suppose. Whereas, of course, I didn't have a coherent past. Now I don't care. I'd quite like to divest myself of pretty much everything and live in a humpy, really. Maybe.
We're talking about memory, but you also write very beautifully in the book that you suggest that forgetting is necessary for the making and maintenance of a life. Can you talk about the importance of forgetting, especially in the process of trying to piece together your mother's life and your life in those years?
Well, I think the forgetting was my technique for survival as a kid. That's simply what I did. And as I said before, it's a good technique. Nothing wrong with it. But I guess eventually those chickens come home to roost and you have to do something with the past. Yeah.
You mentioned before, just a moment ago, being a nomad most of your life, and travel is an enormous love for you. It's threaded throughout the book. It's so interesting to read as well, these wonderful insights about what we used to be able to travel for and what we can maybe no longer travel for. The way that the world has been sort of repackaged for us, for a contemporary self, before I've even gone there. They're startling insights. What do you love about travel?
I actually find travel really difficult and painful. I'm not a good traveller in that sense. It's a pain in the arse often. But it has been so important for me as a way of testing the biases and baggage that I carry with me from my own culture, from my belief systems. And you plunge yourself into another culture and try to look at it from the inside out rather than the outside in. Those beliefs and assumptions and things you thought that were necessary to you are really tested. So it's hugely valuable, I think. And the tragedy now is that travel is seen as a sort of packaging for the consumer. And that idea of immersing yourself in difference and therefore having to work out what you keep and what you throw away, I think that's disappearing.
The other thing,
or it's much more difficult, let's say.
The other thing that runs all the way through this book, and you talked about that revelation you had at the age of 12, which was kind of about freedom, about what freedom meant, consciousness and freedom. But it's all the way through the book, and I wondered if what you loved about India was an experience of freedom. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because so much of your life has been in India.
Well, I went to India sort of by mistake, and I'd never wanted to go. It wasn't on my list of places I wanted to go. I was slightly appalled by the hippie trail, all the diseases and the crappy shit coming back. So it wasn't on my agenda, and I was on my way to London, in fact, to meet Doris Lessing and write tracks. But I just happened to meet a rather extraordinary family there and to see these incredibly extraordinary nomads. And I was then interested in nomadism really from being with Aboriginal mob. So I had this idea that after I'd written tracks, I'd write another book that would be a relationship between the nomadic people, who are very low caste and therefore not powerful, and the family that I was very close to, who are as high caste as you can get and wealthy. But the women of that family were in zananas, so were the prisoners, essentially. So I sort of thought I'd, relate the two things, freedom and being a prisoner. But then I fetched up in London and just forgot entirely about India. And then 10 years later, I was invited to a dinner, and there was a member of that family. And the chances of that happening were so astronomically minute that I took it as a sign. So I went back to India and started researching this project with nomads in the northwest, and eventually married the Indian man that I'd met initially and at the dinner.
So and that was a relationship of almost over 2 decades.
Yes, it was. And it was a terrific marriage because we hardly ever saw each other.
Perfect.
Because I was commuting from London to India and he was very busy with his work, but it was lovely.
Yeah. You're very honest about who you are in the book. I know you say you don't like the I, but I wondered if you had any thoughts about what Robyn in her 20s would have made of Robyn now.
Yes, it's interesting. I sometimes think of that. I mean, there's a part in the book where I'm looking back at her when she arrives in London, and she's as green as grass. She knows nothing. She's so unsophisticated. But she has this sort of arrogant chutzpah. And I think... And so she was very discerning of who she would give her trust and affection to. And it was pretty hard to get past her gate. And I sometimes think that if I'd been there as an adult, she would have flicked me off.
You call this memoir Unfinished Woman, but I'd never got the sense reading it that your goal or mission is to complete yourself.
No.
Why did that phrase stand out for you?
I think it was, it's nicely ambiguous. It's my mother, it's me, it's kind of all of us, really. So I wanted it to have that slightly ambiguous flavour. And, you know, hopefully we don't finish, you know. I mean, we finish when we die, that's what I mean. It's a work in progress.
We're about to turn the lights on in one moment, in one more question, and you've got time for your question, so I hope you've been thinking about them as we've been going along. But I wanted to ask you lastly, Robyn, you know, there are these beautiful strands that I've mentioned that run through the book about family, about memory, about forgetting, about when things come to you, about freedom and travel and love. But the other one that weaves all the way through is home and belonging. And I wondered if I know I said in my introduction that you now live in regional Victoria and you're back in Australia, but whether you have a sense of whether a home is a place or a feeling, what your feelings are right now about what home is for you.
Well, it's complicated. I mean, there is the ideal. The ideal is to be at home everywhere. To be at home in yourself, to be at home in the present moment, to be at home wherever. That's the ideal. And then, of course, there's practical reality. You know, I've lived such a... you know, I can't even remember how many houses I've lived in. It must be hundreds by now. But when I came back to Australia... my partner died, and I had to sort of make a choice about which country. Was it going to be London? Was it going to be India? Was it going to be Australia? And really, the decision to come back to Australia was sort of pragmatic more than anything. And I found this old, sort of slightly run-down house in regional Victoria. And that was 10 years ago, and that 10 years has been the pulling together of these two projects, the pulling together of the book and the making of a home. So I think of that house as the sanctuary that allowed me to write the book, that gave me a safe place. But now, I don't know. I'm a bit sick of being a peasant, actually. I was foolish enough to build a garden. It's really hard work.
Yeah. Wonderful. We've got time now for your questions. We're going to turn the mics on. We're going to turn the lights on, and the lovely Hayley has a microphone. So if you have a question, pop your hand up. It's always hard to go first, but we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah.
Down the front. Thanks, Hayley.
Thanks, Robyn. More of a comment. A couple of things. We're very affected by our childhood. Everybody is, whether we like it or not. And I think we like to avoid what we think is... Avoid our trauma in our childhood. And often it comes back to haunt us as our age, 50s, 60s,
Indeed.
whatever we are.
Definitely.
And I think we, as children, take on a lot of responsibility for the problems of our parents or the
For
traumas.
what happened, yeah.
Yeah. I just wondered if you'd feel okay about commenting about that.
Yes, I think children do feel hugely responsible. That's part of the complexity of trauma. Of course, bad things in childhood lead to adult suffering. But in my own case, let's say, I try to focus away from that and try to see how it has given me fuel, how it has driven me, how it has allowed me to do things that I might not have done otherwise. So to sort of turn it to a different purpose, I guess. And everyone does it differently, I suppose. But even now I don't feel I had a bad childhood. I had a fantastic childhood, a really lucky childhood. And my mother's death, of course, has left scars and wounds and all of that, but
Such a Robyn Davidson response, really.
Well, yes, it's also driven me and no doubt made things happen that might not otherwise have happened. I think that's what I'd say to that.
Time for more questions. Just in the middle. Thanks, Hayley.
Hi, Robyn. I wanted to say thank you so much for Tracks and for Unfinished Woman. I'm a huge fan.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about your next chapter. How do you see this next phase of your story? Because you've been such an incredible boundary breaker, role model. I know you don't see yourself as that, but you're just doing something really interesting with your life. So what is your next phase?
I really don't know, and it's been quite surprising to me. I had thought that when the book had gone off, it was published, that's it, I would have felt this tremendous relief. And all I feel is a sort of, I don't know quite, sort of, it's a slightly empty feeling. It's like, and of course I can't let the book go because I have to talk about it still, part of the job. And so I can neither let it entirely go or be in it. It's a slightly odd place to be. So I'd say there's two streams of thought there. One is that I want to go to university and study biology and become a mycologist. And the other is, and I never want to write another word, that's for sure.
Okay.
And the other is I'm just not sure. I really don't know. And of course, on the darker side, it's what we all have to face ultimately, which is old age, sickness, and death, and being prepared for that. And how are you going to be for that? How actually are you going to be? So all of those things, it's. But that's the extraordinary, terrible richness of life.
Beautiful. We've got time for a few more questions, just down the front.
Hi, Robyn. My name is Mathilde.
Hi.
I think this is just a gobsmackingly perfect book. And I wanted to just ask you about that, you talk about that sort of relationship between forgetting and remembering, and throughout the book you're constantly trying to land it but then sort of come back from it, and you're aware of the fairy tale and the truth. So there's these sort of paradoxes through the whole thing. And I was just interested in how you managed the actual writing of that and the sort of propelling yourself through those back and forths all the time.
It was hell. Just, I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, honestly. Because, well, for several reasons. One was that the book had been written over such a long period of time, and you change. And it was fragmented geographically. So some written in India, some written in UK, some written here and there and everywhere. And so when I finally got the old house, I had boxes of notes, just notes. And, I'd look at them and I'd think, I don't remember writing that, but it's not bad, And so in the end, the process, I did a lot of procrastination. I polished pot plants, because I found it extremely painful to get to the desk, really, pathologically. Because it was so complicated and scattered, and trying to make the form and the structure fit and have a sort of illusion of fluency. It was like a sort of huge 3D jigsaw. So it was really hard work. But then really in the last year it just sort of came together. It was quite interesting.
We've got time, I think, for one more question from the audience. Oh, there are two more. There's one in the middle. Well, we'll take you both.
Yeah.
And maybe the lady at the back. To Kath first, Hayley, thank you.
My question was about your approach to pain, because you've just mentioned a painful process and you obviously are kind of comfortable being uncomfortable. And I'm wondering, where that might come from, or can you talk a bit about your approach to pain and perhaps the usefulness of it?
Yes, it's an interesting question. I seem to be able to tolerate a lot of both physical and psychological pain. So I'm lucky. And I'm not sure why that is. I mean, it could be just having parents who just got on with things, possibly. It could be that I felt pain very early on and therefore was inured to it. Who knows? I mean, we really don't know where these qualities come from. Could be genetic, no idea. But yes, there is an ability to tolerate difficulty.
Is it useful? Is it useful? Like, how do you use that?
Oh, sorry, I can't hear.
Is it useful? How do you use that ability that you have?
How do I use it? Well, to go and do things. Like living with the nomads in northwest India was so hard. I can't tell you how hard it was. Sleeping 2 hours a night, breathing thick, filthy dust, being sick, them being sick, no decent food, but being curious enough. I think it's the curiosity that always is bigger or stronger than all those other things. I think that's what it is. Yeah.
Thank you. There's another question just in the middle row.
Thank you for tonight and for the many hours of wonderful reading.
Thank you.
When you were writing Unfinished Woman, did you read many other memoirs or memoir styles? And if so, were there any that you thought were really great that you would recommend?
Look, to be honest, very few. And I almost consciously didn't read memoir because I didn't want it to kind of colour, maybe, what I was doing. I mean, obviously, and I read a lot. And what one reads sort of goes into the compost in the head and therefore informs the writing and the life. So, yeah, but memoir, I think there's a lot of really bad memoir because people assume it's the easiest form. You just write your life, hey. And who knows your life better than you? Well, it's not. It's a really difficult form to make something of, to make something that's truly honest, I suppose is the word. Honest, yeah. True.
There's one more question from the lady just in the middle aisle. Yep, I'll get the microphone to you.
Actually, Kath asked my question, so I'll just indulge by saying how refreshing it is, Robyn, in a world that's obsessed with simplifying things and packaging things and staying comfortable, to hear someone speak with such clarity about ambiguity and discomfort. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
I want to do things a little bit in reverse. I want to say thank you to you, and then I want to say thank you to Robyn. This year was the first year that the Petersham Bowling Club decided to start the Readers' Books and Conversation series, and we didn't know if people would come. And here we are in December, having had this extraordinary year of support. If you've come to more than a few, we love you. If you've come tonight for the first time, we love you. It's so great to have you with us.
And what a great place.
And it's a great place. And it wouldn't be what it is without the wonderful audiences we've had and the wonderful questions and engagement. So it's a great pleasure to let you know that we will be back next year. Yeah, it's going to be part of what we do here at Petersham. The Magic Petersham Bowling Club team have told us we're coming back, and on February the 29th we will be with Susie Miller, who wrote the wonderful play RBG and the wonderful play Prima Facie that's now a novel, and we'll talk about playwriting and women's stories and much else beyond that. We've got some wonderful other ideas throughout the year. We will be doing a satellite event for Sydney Writers Festival in May, so we hope to see you all back here then as well. But I do want to particularly thank Robyn. I love that last comment tonight about not just hearing Robyn, but that's what the book is like. It's an absolute gift of a book. Such a joy to sort of end the year on this book, I think. It's a book about what makes us who we are and how we hold on to that or how we discard that as we move through life. And it's a powerful testament to your great writing, that the way that you can allow us to experience how someone else lives and thinks, how you live and think. And that's the great power of beautiful writing. I'm so glad you stayed with this draft of the book. I'm so glad that it became Unfinished Woman. And it is an absolute marvel. It's been wonderful to have you here tonight. Please join me in thanking Robyn Davidson. And thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you, Michaela, and thank you all for being here.
Lovely.